My Gavan and Melonine, and well met indeed. I'm Arachir Galadirthan, head of the modding team behind Divide and Conquer, and welcome back to another lore video. Today we shall be dealing with the Shire. But before we get into that, as ever, I'd like to extend my thanks specifically to the following three persons. Chiefly to Zechariah Mosby, who has contributed and assisted the channel in its ongoing survival, so thank you very much. Also to Orgemund, who has done the same and risen to Banner Marshal, should they choose on the Discord. And finally to Ola Andre Engebretsen, who has also risen up and assisted the channel. My thanks to each and every one of you. And as usual, all those who contribute to the channel will get your names listed at the end of the episode. So, without any further ado-ing, let us dive into the Shire. So I've broken this down first of all into the geography of the land, and then the little and scant information we have on the administration of the Shire. As interesting as that sounds, it is interesting. It's just not an inherently boring word, really, isn't it? And then, of course, a little on the history of the Shire, but there's not too much on the history, really. We could spend 2 hours probably talking about the family trees of the Shire, which go into extensive detail in the writings. But that's just saying people's names, really, isn't it? So I've opted not to go for that. So dealing with the first point then, the geography of the Shire. The Shire itself is said to extend for 40 leagues from the Far Downs in the west to the Brandywine Bridge in the east, and 50 leagues from the northern moors to the southern marshes. 1 league is slated as 3 miles of our real-life miles, so it's 120 miles from east to west of the Shire and 150 from north to south. So for perspective, for those of you on this side of the Atlantic, and indeed those in England, London to Birmingham, as the crow flies, is about 100 miles. So the size of the Shire roughly is equivalent to really sort of southeast England if you include the home counties and London as a unit. So going from the coast up to maybe the northern border of Hertfordshire. It's that sort of southern eastern corner. And perhaps an easier way to picture it is that the Shire is slightly larger than the state of Connecticut over in America. So it's no small space, really. It is a lot larger than many people think, myself included, actually. In my head, the Shire was a tiny, tiny, tiny realm. But, I mean, of course, that's not huge, but that's still sizable for hobbits, who, of course, are only about 4 foot. So that's the size of the Shire. To the north, as I say, the Shire is made up of vast open moorlands and just flat grassland, really. There are few people and few things that live in the northern section of the Shire. The western border is bounded first of all by the White Downs, and then these progress into what's known as the Far Downs, and these are just 2 sets of hilly landscapes known under 2 different names, sets of rolling hills, if you will. The eastern border is originally marked by the Brandywine River, or Baranduin River. The Hobbits repurpose it to Brandywine. But then the small extra land of Buckland is founded, and then so the Shire's border creeps up against the Old Forest. It does not extend onto the eastern side of the Brandywine River very far, but it does claim a small enclave on that side, being Buckland. The southern bound is the course of the Brandywine River, but again it then turns into just rolling plains in the southern part of the Shire. On the farthest eastern border, a family of hobbits known as the Old Bucks, who renamed themselves to the Brandybucks, and of whom Meriadoc is one, Meriadoc Brandybuck, they grow a tall hedge that runs for 20 miles from the Brandywine Bridge down to the conflux of the Withywindle and Brandywine rivers, and they call it the High Hay. And it's grown purely to give a natural border on the eastern side, because of course where before the Brandywine River made a natural border, when they moved over and settled Buckland, there was nothing to prevent anyone intruding, so they grew a hedge to keep them out. It's also stated that a small side note on the Bucklanders is that they're known to lock their doors and windows in the evening, which is noted to be most irregular in the Shire. The western border of the Shire was extended in the 4th Age to include the land known as West March, and this is the region that goes from the Far Downs all the way up to the Tower Hills, or as they are known in Sindarin, the Emun Baraid. Now, the Far Downs and the Emun Baraid do sort of merge into one anyway, but this area is... the Downs themselves are then encompassed fully in the Shire, whereas before they made the border of the Shire. A small new village known as Undertowers, because it's built under the towers, is set up in Westmarch, and it's in Undertowers that the Fairbairn family settles down, and this is a family entirely founded by Sam's daughter Eleanor. It's said that in the 4th Age, the Fairbairn family rivals the Tooks and the Brandybucks for the most influential family in the Shire. But the majority of the Shire geographically is made up of, as they described at the sort of opening of the films quite nicely, it is mostly just small, gentle rivers, small thickets, which is a small grouping of trees, not really big enough to be called a wood or a forest, but enough that there's more than just a tree, and green hills, of course. And it is true to say that the Shire is an almost idyllic and not really fantasy. Idyllic's really just the best word. It is an idyllic version of English countryside. Now, English countryside, having lived in England for 28 years and having visited much of it, is very much as the Shire depicts. For most of this country is just rolling gentle hills, woodland and greenery, and so it's just a slightly better is possibly a word for it, but perhaps not the best word. But it's just it's a perfect version of our countryside. So moving on then to deal with how the Shire is actually broken down into governance. There are, of course, 4 main regions that we all know of within the Shire, with a small 5th region that's added later, and then, of course, the extension into Westmarch added in the 4th Age as well. But the original 4 regions are, of course, the 4 Farthings, and it's Buckland that is added as an extra tag on. The 4 Farthings divide the Shire into segments diagonally, roughly speaking. So it's as though if you put a St Andrew's cross across the Shire, then you've got your north, east, south and west segments, and each one of those is a farthing. Buckland, as already mentioned, is that extra add-on on the eastern border, and it operates very, very much independently from the main rules and governance of the Shire itself. But speaking of governance, the Shire doesn't really have a formal central government. It has a couple of figureheads, but it doesn't. There's nothing approaching the lands of, say, Rohan or Gondor, where there's a clear and known leader, and they have elite councils as well that factor into how the country is run, particularly in Gondor, of course, very famously. But in the Shire, it very much, each village really just has the families that are quite notable, and outside of that, there's nothing really. But the de jure highest authority in the Shire is the Thane. So the Thane was first appointed by the Hobbits with the fall of Arnor, and he acts very much as a regent would in a country where the king or queen doesn't live. Because the king originally ruled over the lands of the Shire, and the Hobbits did take him as their sort of not overlord, but they accepted the authority of the king. And so when the king passed, they felt that they needed someone to act in that stead, and they appointed the Thane as that role. But the Thane was charged with presiding over the Shire Moot and leading 2 bands of warriors. Warriors is probably not the right word, but 2 bands of armed citizenry known as the Hobbitry in Arms and the Shire Muster. And he has a role as captain of each of these. But in practice, the Shire is such a peaceful land with so few problems that a military might solve, that the Thane actually does very little indeed. He is accorded a great deal of respect by the Hobbits, and he's obviously, what he says and does has weight, and they do rally behind him as a figurehead, but he has nowhere near the kind of power that Denethor has in Gondor, for example. There's no official seat or throne of the Thane, and it really is verging on just a ceremonial position by the time of the 4th Age. The only thing that likens it to a kingdom is that the Thaneship is very much hereditary, and originally all of the Thanes were taken from a very notable family called the Old Bucks. But then when the old bucks decided, for whatever reason, that they'd had enough and they were buggering off to Buckland to found their own land and rule under, for whatever reason, the Took family then became the family that gives the Thane each year. And indeed, at the time of the War of the Ring, Pippin's own father is the Thane of the Shire, and then of course Pippin very famously becomes the Thane himself in the Fourth Age. The next highest authority in the Shire, although it's not Shire-wide, but has much authority in the specific town in which he resides, is the Mayor of Mitchell Delving. So this is the closest thing the Shire has to a capital, and it's called the Chief. I think Tolkien calls it the Chief Dwelling, or Chief Township, perhaps. But anyway, it's essentially the capital of the Shire, and that's Mitchell Delving in the west. It stands on the western border of the Shire. It's not in the centre. But the mayor there holds quite a lot of power, and he resides over the Shire's postal service, which is said to be incredibly active and very busy, for the hobbits love to write to one another. So the post is a very respected and renowned position, or postmen are, and the mayor resides over that entire service. He's also the chief sheriff. So the sheriffs are the closest thing that the Shire has to police, but there are hardly any of them in practice. So they maintain the law and order in the Shire, and there are 3 in each farthing, so there are only 12 altogether. And they don't really have underlings or anything else. They're just, if there's ever a dispute, which is always verbal in the Shire, it's a really, really peaceful land. They do not come to blows or altercations. But if there's ever any sort of upset or nuisance, then the sheriffs will go and sort it out. The worst situations they really have to deal with are nosy and annoying neighbours in practice. But the mayor also presides over one force of the Shire which does have a real role to play, and those are the Bounders. And so the Bounders are a group of hobbits who live on the boundary of the Shire, and they chase away any threat or stranger that comes to the Shire. Or so they think, of course, because the Bounders have little to no idea that actually every single day the peace and prosperity of the Shire is maintained by the Dunedain in secret, who keep the Shire safe. Another regional power is the Master of Buckland, who resides at Brandy Hall. And he, of course, is the head of both the Brandybuck family and the sort of quasi-governor of Buckland, which lives under very much its own rules. I've already mentioned that the main settlement of the Shire is Mitchell Delving, where many, many hobbits live, and most of them in houses rather than underground. Vying for the second most important settlement is a bit of a tie between the two townships of Tuckbrew and Bucklebury. So Tuckbrew is the home of the Tooks, and it's the administrative power of the a little section in the centre south of the Shire known as the Tookland, which is where most of the Tooks live. In Tuckbrew, many hobbits live in grand underground constructs, and there's one large underground construct known as the Great Smeels. Smeels is the proper name for a small little hobbit home, but the Great Smeels in Tookland is a vast, cavernous-like structure that is warm and homely and nothing like a dwarven mine, but it is a large place where many, many families live, all within this one. Think of it sort of like a block of flats, but underground. That is what it is like. And as I say, its counterpart is the town of Bucklebury, where the Bucklebury Ferry is found. And this is built around Brandy Hall, which is another great underground dwelling that the hobbits built. And Brandy Hall is the seat of the Master of Buckland, and that is where the most important Brandybucks live. And then the rest of the people that live in Buckland, or most of the people in Buckland, then live in Bucklebury, which surrounds Brandy Hall, or the hill that Brandy Hall is built on. As I say, Smeels are the name for the hobbits' underground homes, and Tolkien notes that only really the very poor or very wealthy actually live underground. The former live in simple burrows with little in the way of furnishings, and barely even, they'll be lucky if they have a window. Whereas the latter, of course, such as Bilbo, live in those great, cosy, grand hollows that have nice wooden walls, doors, windows, paintings, furnishings, something that feels cosy. But they don't all live like that. And as I say, a lot of hobbits do actually live in houses. Houses are just as common in the Shire as Smeels are. I've never really been quite sure if it's Smeels or Smiles, But I think it's Smeels, but it's a very, very archaic word. I think it's borrowed from... I can't quite remember. I want to say Anglo-Saxon, but I don't think it is. But I can't quite remember. I should have written that down, really, shouldn't I? Often, many Hobbit families will live within the same Smeel, and so they extend them as necessary. So rather than your son moving out with his new wife or whatever, or your daughter moving out with their new husband, you'd simply extend your home, and they'll live in another wing of your home. That's a fairly common practice. Because the Shire is a land that is broken up into many clans, and family loyalty and family genealogy are very, very important to Hobbits. It's almost their chief pastime is tracing their family and keeping their families together. So, turning then to the founding of the Shire, as I mentioned, originally the land that would become the Shire was part of the Kingdom of Arthedain, or rather the Kingdom of Arnor, and then the subdivision it retained, Arthedain retained the lands of the Shire. It was used by the king chiefly as farmland and hunting grounds, and was sparsely populated. It was a very gentle country, and we don't really know of any battles or wars that took place specifically in the Shire, whilst Angmar, of course, waged war against all of Arnor and then Arthedain itself. So the Shire has been a very peaceful land for a very long time. And 1,601 years into the Third Age, so everything to do with the Shire takes place in the Third Age, which is the age, of course, that the ring is destroyed in. This is the age we're all very familiar with, because the films that we all have seen take place in this time, or many of us have seen. So about halfway through the Third Age, because the Third Age itself is roughly 3,040 something years. So we're 1,600 years in, so about halfway through the Third Age. Two Fallowhide brothers, Fallowhide being one of the three types of Hobbit, if you will. Fallowhides, Stores, and I've foolishly forgotten the third name, because again, didn't write that down, because that pertains to Hobbits rather than the Shire. But anyway, two Hobbit brothers, Marcho and Blanco. They lead a number of Hobbits out of Bree at this time, and they cross over the Brandywine River, where they settle with leave of the king. So they do approach him, and he says, yep, that's fine, you can stay there. And within only a very, very short amount of time, almost all Hobbits in existence migrate to the Shire to claim this as their own, with only a few Hobbits actually staying outside of the Shire. The king allows the Hobbits to stay on the requirement that they maintain any roads that pass through the Shire, and that they speed any of his messengers on their way, so they don't disrupt any of the king's messengers or any of his sort of scouts or companies or anything that needs to come through the Shire to speak with the king. And in return, he gives them essentially autonomy. The king has no bearing on the Shire whatsoever. He makes no declarations. I'm not even sure that a king ever visits the Shire. He gives it over wholly to the Hobbits as long as they just help his messengers through. As I say, with the death of the king and with the fall of Arnor, a Hobbit named Bucker of the Marish, who is one of the forefathers of the Brandybuck family, he is appointed as the first Thane. And his family holds the thaneship for about 300 years, until a Hobbit known as Gorhendad Oldbuck crosses the Brandywine River, founds Brandy Hall, and with it the region of Buckland. Thus, the Brandybucks are founded. But as the Brandybucks strike out on their own and make themselves somewhat removed from the rest of the Shire, it is decided that the Thane should be taken from within, and so a Took then becomes the new Thane of the Shire. However, the residents of a place called the Marish, where the original Thane was from, Bucker of the Marish, this is the Marish is a small section of land that resides on the western bank of the Brandywine River. So they're just a stone's throw away from Buckland. But they very much take the Master of Buckland as their leader. So the Marish is a sort of extension of Buckland that just juts into the Shire. So there's all these different power plays going on, really. The Shire is barely touched by grief throughout the rest of its history, but there are a few occasions that are notable to mention where the situation within does grow quite dire. And the first and greatest of these is the Great Plague. Now, the Great Plague comes through in 1636, and the Shire is founded in 1601, so it's only 35 years after the Shire is founded that the Great Plague hits, and it kills so many hobbits. It is the worst disaster in the Shire's history. Nothing else kills more than the Great Plague, as far as we're aware. Of course, there's nothing that the hobbits can do about the Great Plague, and in the end, it just eventually dies out of its own accord after it claims all those lives it's going to claim, and all those who are going to be immune to it become immune to it, and it passes on and dies away. So then the Shire gets a long, long time of growth and peace and no real trouble. So the next event that troubles the Shire after the plague of 1636 is an invasion by orcs over 1,000 years later. So the Shire has 1,000 years of complete autonomy and just not connected at all with the outside world. And the orcs that sweep into the Shire come from a place called Mount Graham, which is on the southern border of Angmar. So they've come quite a long way. They've come miles, in fact, absolute miles. If you're looking at a map of Middle-earth, which I've probably put on the screen, Mount Graham is said to be at the end of the small arm that extends on the northern borders of the Etten Moors. So they've come really quite far. And they're famously defeated by Bandobras Bullroarer Took at the Battle of Green Fields, and that's in 2747. So as I say, over 1,100 years later. And then, in a very short space of time, only 11 years later, so in the memory of most of the hobbits who will have known the Battle of Green Fields, the long winter comes upon the Shire. And this also kills a great many hobbits. It was a very deep and fierce winter. It completely ruins the usual very fertile nature of the Shire. And incidentally, actually, this is the same winter that claims the life of King Helm Hammerhand of Rohan, so to play it in with other events. The long winter isn't the sole reason for their sadness and grief, however, because it gives way into a period known as the Days of Dearth. And this is the years immediately following the long winter, where famine then strikes at the Shire. And it claims many, many lives. So this is another period where natural disaster affects the Shire. The only invasions are the Battle of Greenfields and, of course, the Scouring. But the Shire's greatest enemy is the planet itself, Arda itself. Penultimately, before the Scouring, the only other event that negatively impacts on the Shire is the Fell Winter that comes in 2911, so about 200 years later, or just under 200 years later. And this is just another deep and fierce winter, but this time it brings wolves, and wolves roam abroad in the Shire for the first time in the memory of many, many hobbits. Also, of course, hunger then again grips the Shire, but this time the hobbits are saved without really understanding or knowing, but they are protected and defended by the Dunedain and Gandalf, who is, of course, in Middle-earth by this time. He's been here for a few thousand years by now. So the Shire is already then having its problems relieved by secret assistance. Lastly, of course, the Shire was taken over by Sharku, Saruman in disguise, at the end of the Third Age, and many hobbits are made to suffer. But the death toll, comparatively to the events before, seems to be relatively light, and Saruman was eventually ousted, of course, through the efforts of Sam, Pippin, and Merry. Frodo does play a part, but he's not as influential as the other three in rallying the Shire around ousting Saruman. It's the others who gather a makeshift army and manage to free the people with the help of the Tooks. But the Scouring of the Shire is very much worthy of its own video, so I've not discussed that at length here. And so that is something I would hope to cover in another video, but that then concludes this video. The Shire's history is quite simply short, because whilst the actual history of the Shire is a good 1,500 years, not much really happens, so there's not all that much that one can talk about. So as I say, that then concludes our little roundup of all the information we have on the Shire. Now, as I say, I could very well do a topic on the Hobbits themselves rather than the Shire itself and talk about, but I'm fairly certain I've already done one on the Hobbits, so I thought it'd be interesting to focus on the Shire instead. And if I can remember, I'll link that in the video at the end. So all that remains is for me to thank you all very much for listening, and to thank those whose names are now upon the screen for supporting the channel. I do hope at this time that you are all keeping well and not too stir-crazy with being indoors, if you are indeed at the moment. Thank you very much for listening, and until we speak again, Navar na den Pedamad Melonin, and farewell.